All right, thanks, Katie. Yes, we are going to be speaking about fun with evergreen foliage and what fun it can be. So, when it comes to making a wreath, one thing to consider would be the wreath size. And there's a variety of sizes that are available of different forms that you can purchase. You could also make a frame with even a piece of wire, usually a similar gauge to that of a coat hanger, and you could even assemble a wreath frame in from a coat hanger. But the outer diameter of the wreath, comparatively, is going to be larger than the ring diameter because that foliage is going to expand past that. And so you might want to keep that into consideration whenever you're planning for making a wreath, that you look towards the end product of the wreath that you're going to make and judge accordingly to the size that you're going to desire to build. How many tips are needed whenever we build a wreath? So typically we use the tips of branches when we're building a evergreen wreath, and there's increase of the amount of pounds needed for building a wreath, and you can see that from an 8-inch wreath to a 16-inch diameter wreath, that's increasing not only double in the size of the diameter, but triple the amount of pounds that you need to provide for making a wreath. So it's something to consider. You don't want to run out of material, and you want to have it pretty uniform for the materials that you have in order to make it all the way around the circumference of the wreath frame. So we have quite a few conifers in the Midwest to choose from. Probably the top five are listed here. We have pines and spruce and juniper, arborvitae, yew, and a lot of these are commonly found in our landscapes and could make a good potential for making some materials to be utilized for wreaths. There's some materials that aren't as readily available, and some that you may not put to use, like a hemlock loses its needles pretty readily if it's indoors, so probably not one for an indoor wreath. But a lot of these can also be commercially purchased. Your fir, probably the most prominent fir that's used is the noble fir. You could also find Douglas fir at a local garden center or nursery, and some pine material is often common. And you can also find a variety of pine cones often to add to your wreath. So, for the care of decorative greens, if you do purchase them, they come in pretty much a cardboard box that has a waxy kind of coating on it. And so they're trying to preserve the moisture of these greens. And so you'll want to keep them in a cool location, and you don't want to, expose them to heat whenever you're bringing it into the inside. And so the main focus is the humidity and the amount of moisture. So you may have to add a spritz of water on occasion, maybe twice a week. And there are some anti-transpirants that could be used, but you have to use caution whenever you're applying those, because some of the things that have waxy coating, like the juniper berries, that will strip that coating from them, and they'll lose their coloring. But there's a wide variety of evergreens to choose from, and you may find some in your own backyard. So some of the traits to look for when it comes to the branches that you're going to be looking for, whether you're purchasing them or looking in your own yard, is branch symmetry. So it's good to have, some symmetry to those branches, where those secondary branches complement one another. You definitely want to look for dark green or a deep blue color. You don't want to use anything that's got like a yellowing to it. The closely clumped secondary branches is a good aspect. You want to be able to hide the frame behind, uh, and we typically use 4 to 6 inch cuttings of this material, and then have your larger cutting in the back, and then your smaller pieces in the front as it's attached to the wreath. Typically, we want to see plants that are free from disease or needle loss. So it may not be the thing to pick up limbs from the landscape. They may have fallen there prior to a hard frost, and the hard frost is something that you want to look for because you want to obtain your material after a hard frost, because then your trees are going to go into a dormant stage, and that's going to be less harmful on the tree and better for needle retention for the evergreen branches that you harvest. You want to typically use thin branches that can be pruned fairly easily, and you'll need a pair of pruners whenever you're putting your wreath together. And again, a prior exposure to hard frost. And another thing about getting your material, when it comes to holly, maybe you have a holly that you're going to harvest, but you want to do your harvesting whenever the temperatures are above freezing for holly, because it can affect the foliage after it's harvested. But typically, the harvested holly, it can store uh, for a duration of period of time, 14 days at 45 degrees and almost a couple of months at freezing temperatures, but it will freeze at 26 degrees Fahrenheit, so something to keep in mind. So here we have an example of the growth of a fir, and this shows how it grows each year and why you need a few substantial years of growth in order to harvest that limb. And when harvesting from your trees, you want to leave some growth behind, so that way you can have a regenerative cut. So if you have lateral branches that are coming from that tip, those can continue to grow, and then you can harvest the material that you need. But typically we just harvest the tips of the branches whenever we're utilizing them for wreaths. Here's a little note on pruning. We have some annual pruning that can be done to firs or spruces, but this lines up with how we would remove some of the foliage. You want to have some of the lateral branches so that would V out from the terminal branch that you would be harvesting. So that gives it a point of continued growth. And when harvesting from pines, it's kind of the same principle that you want to have just the tips to be harvested, or if you're doing some pruning of your Christmas tree, you might remove some of those lower branches to fit it in the house and to utilize them. So here we have some already harvested, could be commercially purchased evergreen material. And again, this could be firs, spruces. Oftentimes we'll find things like pine. And so these are going to be larger than what you're going to need for building your wreath. You're going to need to have a pair of loppers or a pair of pruners to cut these down to size. And here we can see how some of this, you know, thick woody material on the ends of the branches, that's just going to be too hard to utilize into the wreath, and you'll just have to make small cuts, usually about 4 to 6 inches. Here's some materials that have already been utilized, and you can see with this pine branch how some of those smaller limbs have been used, and there's just a wide variety of types of evergreen foliage that you can use and incorporate into that wreath. So you'll want to look for good, uniform color, and harvest the best symmetrical branches that you can. And sometimes, these bows can be put into just a decorative swag and presented that way here with a nice red ribbon. But it's not only just, the needled evergreens. We also have some flat kind of foliage that can be used, and you can also use artificial materials to be incorporated in the wreath as well. Here's some examples of some commercially made wreaths, and you see that they have had a wreath making machine where it crimps the wire around, and that is what's typically done for some of these commercial wreaths that are made. There has been times in the past where I've had to utilize some Christmas tree material in order to make a wreath. Had some workshops that needed some wreath material, and there was a little bit of a shortage for that kind of greenery. So I utilized some Christmas tree, and again, you can use the lower limbs and make good use of those for your holiday wreath. Here's another example of the commercial kind of wreath. And you can see that even whenever it's just one particular plant material, that can be sufficient in creating a wreath. Here's a decorative wreath. You can see just some of the artistic nature of putting a wreath together. We see how there's different kinds of foliage, some pine interspersed, and you typically go in the same direction. So you'll either go clockwise or counterclockwise. And for a beginner, sometimes it's easier to go counterclockwise as you're going to be wrapping the wire around the wreath frame to secure the foliage. Here's a close-up of the wreath. Usually your fir needles will tend to point upward, and we also see some pine interspersed here in this wreath. So the amount of foliage that you incorporate will depend on the size of your wreath that you're making. So I do like the contrast of the different styles of needles, and that's something that you can work into your wreath arrangement. So it's important to characterize the differences in some of these materials. So for fir bows, they're individually attached needles. So there's not a peg on the stem of the needle. So whenever you detach a fir needle, it tends to be smooth. There's no peg there that's going to be like it would be on a spruce. These needles are flat and they have a whitish underneath to them. And if you look at a fir cone, it tends to grow, it'll be growing upright, whereas a spruce will hang from below the limb. And the cones of the fir are deciduous, and so they shatter when they mature, and that's how they disperse their seeds. Now here we see the spruce. This is a Norway spruce that is typical of being probably one of the better pine cones to use in a spruce arrangement. And so these have a little bit more of a sharp needle end to the needle. And so the needles will leave those stubs when they're removed. And as you can see, the cones hang downward. And when the cones fall, they will fall intact. And the cones will have a papery kind of feeling to them, unlike the pine cones that are woody in nature. So here we have some pine. You can do some plant identification with the pine needles. So they come in clusters or also called fascicles. And these are either in groupings of 2, 3, or 5 needles. And the length of the needle can also aid in identification. But typically, if you see a white pine, it's going to have 5 needles in the fascicle. And so that grouping of 5 needles will indicate that identification. And cedar, they have a scaly, like blunt, dark green foliage. And these immature cones that are oval in shape can add a nice decorative touch to your wreath. For storing the wreaths, You want to store them in a cool, damp location, not excessively damp. I would say also good air circulation is key to their preservation, but you want to shelter them from the wind, the rain, and also if they're indoors, you want to keep them away from the heat register and direct sunlight. You don't want them to be overexposed. If you have some leftover material, like window box outdoors. You can incorporate some of that material that you have left over into that and create, another masterful work of art. And it is pretty artistic when it comes to building wreaths. You just utilize the materials that you have and, try and find the accents that you want to find. And when you harvest your evergreen material, you may want to look out for any wildlife that may be present and be cautious of that. And also to note safety for children and pets. There are some of our popular holiday plants that have poisonous berries, and so you'll want to keep those from your children or pets. Some of these include hollies, yews, or mistletoe, and those pearly white berries of mistletoe are particularly toxic. The Good Growing team does have a blog and also a podcast, so you can check out these QR codes to find those or these short URLs. I did create an evaluation for this presentation. You can go there through this short URL, or there is a QR code here to access that and to take the evaluation.